Hi, this is David Humphrey. I hope you enjoy this talk that I gave at the Vermont Studio Center in 2019. I'm here quarantined in my studio, as you may be, but I love the Vermont Studio Center, and it might present the most exquisite quarantine you could have. Thank you. I have this very ticky habit of apologizing before we start, apologizing for so many things that are kind of betrayed by this situation. One of them is that these are paintings without soundtrack. They're silent. And so here they come, you'll see them as with me chattering along, telling you what to think or what not to think or where to look. And I feel like that takes away your freedom. I mean, your freedom is kind of diminished here in a couple ways. One, that I'm talking. The other is that you can't put your nose on the object and walk away and turn your back on it, look at something else, or look at it in your own, according to your own terms. And I feel like that's a kind of an important part of, what do you call it, the sociability of artworks, that artworks presumably, hopefully, elaborate a kind of relationship with each spectator one at a time. It's part of their peculiar strength and also their weakness, their intimate things, their objects. And so I feel like I want to apologize for that. The other thing is too that they're lined up in a certain kind of order, as though there was a narrative that this leads to that, or that these things are grouped according to some story or teleology or something along those lines that is completely constructed. I mean, this might be. I'm going to show you a lot of work from the early '80s until now, and it's not even it's just a small percentage of them kind of organized because they kind of tell a weird story. So one of the weird stories that they tell has to do with this idea of sociability. I mean, I have this book out of art writing called Blind Handshake, and in a way I was thinking about the relationship between the artist kind of who works in solitude. There's this sort of very rich and strange solitude under which things get made, and then spectators come and look at them by themselves, or maybe in a small group, but in a weird way, that handshake is kind of blind. Like you don't really, the artist never really encounters the spectator in the way that, let's say, musicians do. So this first picture is from the '90s, and there it is. It's kind of a self-portrait alone in the studio, sort of confronting the blank canvas. But I mean, for instance, in this case, it's from a photograph, but it's actually very materially painted, and like those lights up on the ceiling are just emphatically kind of material. They're blobs of paint kind of stuck on the surface, and in a weird way, this photograph, the image of the painting, kind of flattens it back into its original photo source, and maybe that's kind of weirdly interesting in itself. This is another kind of studio painting I made more recently. Kind of a variation on the Matisse studio painting. I don't know when it was from, maybe 1904 or something like that. But I sort of substituted a laptop for his easel and turned the floor into a kind of slightly hallucinatory spill. But I like this idea of the dark room, the sort of the interior, the room, the studio as a kind of prosthetic body, and as not just as a space of production, but a space of thinking and being alone. No, what do you call it? What would it be? Like a very crowded solitude. So I'm gonna sort of start with some images that have to do with collaboration or others, and I kind of want to thicken the sociability of the making of a painting. I mean, of course, when you make a painting, you're using forms and materials that are all loaded with historic past, and so in a way, you're already kind of having a collaborative relationship with those procedures, images, materials. This painting pictures a kind of a collaborative relation, although it's a little peculiar with this kind of ass palette. But anyway, there's a helping out here. It's called plein air. And then in the early zeros, I started thinking about the paintings of Dwight Eisenhower. He took up painting at the suggestion of his friend Winston Churchill, who was kind of an accomplished painter. And Winston told him that it might help him relax. And so this is a portrait of Winston and Ike going out to do some painting in the snow. I mean, I think in some ways these were also inspired by my visits to Vermont. The snow here is so amazing. There's something about the whiteness of this kind of chilly Arcadia that kind of highlights different colors. This is called Ike Paints from Life. And there he is, working from the model. So then I actually did a group of paintings in which I copied the Eisenhower works. And his works tended to be sort of sentimental. I think he often would use like Hallmark cards as sources. And so in a way, he was a sort of a postmodern amateur. And so like working with his imagery, I mean, actually just trying to copy it was a strange form of intimacy with the powerful man, the supreme Allied commander, president, of the United States. And then I would kind of populate them with protagonists that he probably would not have thought of. I kind of think of this as Ike and Winston. So he kind of favored, sentimental images, old mills and rundown barns, not these protagonists. This one's called Ike's Bridge. So, that's one form of collaboration. It's a little bit of a one-way collaboration, but to sort of work with a source is to establish some complicated connection that I hoped anyway that something new would emerge. But then I also do actual collaborations. I mean, this was a peculiar painting in which there was a friend. My friend Charlene von Heil threw out a stretcher. Her studio was across the hall from me, and another person on the floor gave it to her kids and their friends to do a giant. I think it's about an 8-foot painting, giant collaborative finger painting. Now she's going to throw it out, and I thought this is really great and really interesting and rich, and so I made a painting on it and from it. These colors are very strange. I'm just going to roll with it. I'm not going to complain. But this is kind of very amped up. But I love the idea that somehow this character in the painting is kind of immersing in the turbulent field of, or the swamp in a way, of like little finger paintings. And so it's a kind of, it's a super tactile landscape space that I tried to kind of make a new thing out of. But I was also part of a collaborative entity called Team Shag, which was Amy Silman, David Humphrey, and Elliot Green, Shag. And so we made paintings together. We made a whole bunch of them. This is one. This is another. We would sort of start a couple, pass them around, and then this new thing emerged, this strange new entity that was collaborative. And it was a kind of a lovely and somewhat fraught form of intimacy. We didn't really paint at the same time, but we made these kind of new composite things. And then I have another, and then I also collaborate with Jennifer Coates, who I'm married to. And we've done a few shows of collaborative paintings. For us, collaboration is a kind of a peculiar way to amuse each other. God, these colors are so amped up. I feel like they might be better than the painting. I don't know. Then I did a show at Postmasters Gallery with a guy called Adam Sianovic, and we told the story of Walt Disney. It was kind of a biographical collaborative show. And so Adam does these massive kind of wall paintings, and then I provided all the the narrative material that hung on these things. So we kind of divided it into locations. This is Dwight's. Whoa, what am I saying? Walt's birthplace, I guess. And then he started his business in Kansas City. That's there on the left. So my idea was that Walt Disney had a kind of, he didn't invent cell animation, but he sure turned it into something major, and he definitely made the first feature-length animated films, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, all of these things, and they were all kind of in the 30s, and it was during the Depression when he could hire anybody he wanted and not pay them that much, and so like as the Depression started to wane and the studio became successful, they had a strike, and he was very disillusioned and became right wing. And he was already kind of pulling away from the studios and took up polo as a hobby until he got into an accident and the other person in the accident died. And so he never got on a horse again, but then took up model railroads, model trains, which laid the tracks for, in my theory, theme parks. And so this is the moment when he has the accident, and there on the right, you see the construction of Magic Mountain. Okay, enough of Walt, but these are collaborative, and I kind of I guess I even sort of like the idea that like the solitary artist is in effect working a kind of collaborative relationship with split off parts of themselves. I mean, at the most basic level, that would be when you make a mark or you do something, you perform an action. Maybe you're being obedient to the command to do that action. I mean, and then when you stand back and evaluate it and decide what it was that you did, well, that's already one kind of a split. And I think that those splits begin to multiply in kind of rich and interesting ways that can be registered in artworks. So now we go back. From here, it's kind of a chronological run through of work starting in the early 80s. So I'm like a 27-year-old. This is about a 12-foot painting. It's kind of the moment of neo-expressionism. I kind of caught the second wave of that. I started to show, my first show was in 84, and so I got kind of understood as a neo-surrealist, whatever that was. But I ended up in shows with people like George Condo or Kenny Scharf, and I don't know. It wasn't really a movement, but sometimes the media wants to kind of make movements, and so it's an echo boom of neo-expressionism. But I was like just thinking about imagery and thinking about ways of telling stories in peculiar ways. Like this is kind of interspecies story. Maybe this person wants to help out with the birds, and he has a worm, some food. There's a kind of a weird suggestion that there's a kind of a blinding going on, the kind of the berries that are being purveyed by the birds. So this was a kind of an origins story painting. I wanted to conflate, the eating of the fruit of knowledge in the Garden of Eden with the George Washington story of chopping down the cherry tree in the form of this kind of weird zygote embryonic character. But then I got a little impatient with the sort of heavy-handedness of those earlier paintings and the way they were sort of taken as like very emphatically first person, like and maybe this is a kind of a young person's like aggressive impulse, and so I wanted to kind of complicate it with maybe a certain kind of other kinds of voice, second-handedness, and so I started to quote historic sources, add other material in. There was a time also when painting was being interrogated for its kind of complicit, masculinist, don't know, what else? Kind of commodity status. And so I wanted to kind of use historic sources in a more complicated way. And I was starting to think about authority, and I guess and different sort of architectures of authority, or architectures of collective identity, like courthouses or schoolhouses, and the way they could, if I could somehow fold them into considerations of the body, or kind of maybe what's the word? Hybridizing architectural and bodily imagery into a story about the self, the kind of vexed self. But I'm always trying to kind of find ways of metaphorizing the medium, like the liquidity, the gooiness of paint, its drippiness, or, and in this case I was thinking about trying to metaphorize the support. And it was at a time, so this is like the late 80s, and I had a kid, and every day I'm kind of looking at it, and probably was wrong to be using disposable diapers. And I kind of thought, that maybe that what is revealed on the diaper is a kind of a communication. It's a painting. It's a form of painting. Anyway, here it's like the diaper gets opened up and it says empire. Because babies are kind of little imperial monsters. They're just, sort of dictators of need, I thought at the time. So then classrooms, another kind of place where individuals are forged into groups, and I thought that would be a kind of interesting subject. I did a whole series of classroom paintings. And of course, families, the root of all these kind of complicated identity questions. In this case, I guess I was thinking of like this family cluster, and I had found a resource for like factory paintings. They were very inexpensive paintings, just done in assembly line way, and I glued this bunch of grapes and fruit into the center, trying to kind of maybe make a sort of slightly extended metaphor between the dot of mechanical reproduction and the proliferation of what units, family units, individual units, into this kind of strange cluster. And then I decided I'd gotten my first Mac computer, and I had a scanner, and I discovered on a visit home a stash of photographs that I had taken as a kid. These are my three sisters, and I thought it would be interesting to kind of treat my own past as a kind of collaborative other. And so I've made a lot of paintings based on these source materials that I would take a photocopy of the photograph, bring it back to my studio. I had a little hand scanner, scan that into the computer, print it out, take a photograph of it, and then project it. Okay, so that the original image, or you could say that the original memory, went through this kind of very long itinerary between photomechanical iterations and reproductions, and would just become more and more degraded, but also kind of would, in its decreased resolution, opened up a space for projection from, or that I could conjure things from it, add things on top, vandalize it. In a way, I could establish a ground on which I could make new narratives that would be saturated with feeling. And I guess in a way, I thought of it as being perhaps analogous to what certain kind of fiction writers or memoirists do. Maybe more a fiction writer than memoirist. Because I'm not really telling any truths, I'm telling new stories. I'm kind of spinning, I'm elaborating themes that seem to be kind of in there, saturated. I mean, there's a picture of my sister back there. It's completely blown out on the screen. I think it looks kind of good that way, but it's not accurate. And I also discovered was my first encounter with Japanese cartoons, graphic fiction, anime. I didn't even know it was anime yet, and I was really kind of shocked and disturbed by this proliferation, or rather conflation of like violence and sexuality and innocence in a way that I thought I wanted to kind of spend time with, because I didn't understand it. Not that painting it would actually make understanding, but it would make a kind of a complicated, rich space of productive disorientation. But what I realized after working with images, photographs from my own past that I remembered, that I had in fact effectively destroyed the memories and replaced them with the new kind of versions that I'd made of them. And I thought that was kind of a peculiar psychological effect or work, and I realized maybe it would be interesting to push back further to a time before I was born that I don't remember, but from which I am a consequence. And so I did a bunch of paintings around my parents' wedding. And like I think I worked on these paintings for a couple years, but it was really like only 20 minutes of the wedding. It wasn't the whole thing. It was just like a few key moments. And I thought that was a very odd and peculiar dilation of time, or a kind of compression and an expansion of it at the same time, where the people in the photographs became part of a repertory company, and I made many paintings. Like this one, like there's two different versions. The first one was very large. Second one is much smaller. But I love that the flash, the source of illumination, is reflected in the window and becomes a kind of a strange, sacred force. It's both it's the point of view and the source of illumination, but also this sacralizing of the groom. Here are a few others. It kind of freaked my family out. They didn't really particularly like having me mess with their stuff. But that actually kind of made the charge a little more alive for me too. That it was the stakes were odd. And then I thought, oh, enough. I don't even like my family that much. Why am I spending so much time with them? I mean, it seemed like it felt to me like I was being like a kind of like an alien surrealist anthropologist studying the peculiar mating habits of white people in mid-century America. And then so I thought, okay, I'm done. But then this movie came out called The Dark Half. It's a George Romero. You guys know George Romero. He made Night of the Living Dead. He's a Pittsburgh filmmaker. I grew up in Pittsburgh. And he made this film called The Dark Half. And my parents had sold the house that I grew up in, and then people who bought it sold it, and it was on the market. And so he actually shot the movie in that house. So like I had made a lot of paintings of some of these rooms, and it's just really strange to see. I guess it's a version of the uncanny, to see something very deeply personal in mass culture. And this was a moment in the life of computers where you could you could run a video into the computer, and I could grab frames, and then I could erase everything that George Romero put into my house, and then replace in those gaps images from my own image repertoire. So it was it was another strange form of collaboration in which I felt like I was kind of claiming something that was mine, that I remembered, except for I recognized it in a movie, a Hollywood movie. But then I kind of decided to move on, and this was like the moment. This is like, where are we? We're in the mid 90s now, and digital cameras had not really come onto the market, but there were like toy ones that you could take snapshots with, and I like the idea of taking a photograph, putting it in the computer, and then I would spend time thinking about an image 5 minutes ago, and maybe even work months on a painting of something that happened just a few minutes, at one moment where you hardly notice anything, and like looking out a car windshield. And I guess maybe the car windshield is also another way to metaphorize the support. It's like there's the lens, there's the windscreen, there's glasses. These are all like barriers between the subject and the sensorium, let's say. And so I thought it'd be an interesting way to kind of make a painting to kind of springboard off of those kind of analogies. So now it's getting into the later 90s, and I'm starting to get restless with the photograph, and so I started to think about sort of certain kinds of vernacular illustration, especially forms that are derived from photographs, but used to make movie posters or political posters, especially in third world, and in which I thought I considered rhetorics of face. And so I did a whole bunch of works kind of thinking about faces in which all the kind of the terms would be ones that were meant to kind of celebrate a very well-known or celebrity or a politician's face, but which I kind of took that out, and you were left with, these are like very large 8-foot, 7-foot paintings, just the pure rhetoric of face. But then I realized, working from sources, especially sources that disoriented me, was really a strange and productive way of coming up with images. And so, I would troll yard sales, thrift stores. This is a painting based on a little painting I found of a woman with a really peculiar haircut and spiky insectoid fingers that somebody must have made thinking it was really sexy, and that somebody must have bought it thinking it was, and now it's kind of found its way back out into the market, kind of abandoned from those desires, and now I'm thinking about the residue of other people's desires. And I would start to kind of mix images. This muscle man was based on a painting by this guy Luca Signorelli. I don't know if you guys know Luca Signorelli. He's kind of an amazing Renaissance painter, and he's got this massive chapel in Orvieto, which is kind of the origins of Beefcake, I thought. He definitely influenced Michelangelo. But all his figures have these kind of detachable seeming parts, and I thought, oh, that's a strange idea of the homoerotic, that all the parts could kind of have their own independent life. This is based on a painting by Felix Vallotton. Interestingly, he's got a show now at the Met, which I haven't seen, but he's kind of an amazing painter. But the figure anyway came from a painting he made of this woman squatting with her knee squishing her breast. And I thought, wow, Felix, why did you think that was a kind of a cool image? I don't really know why, but I decided to linger on the strangeness of his desire, and then I could then make a new thing based on that. I was looking at some physique magazines. This one's called Phone Boy. This is sort of my idea of an enunciation. It's beefcake meets cheesecake. And I was marveling at the way that guy was packed. It's sort of disorienting, but he turns out to be a really interesting artist called George Quaintance, who, and look at that thigh. Anyway, I tried to honor it. Maybe I got it wrong. But anyway, George Quaintance kind of inspired Tom of Finland, and started this tradition. Here's another version. And so then I kind of got in the business of thinking about making new couplings from heterogeneous sources, and I thought I kind of emerged as an artist in I guess the time of postmodernism, postmodernist painting, and in in the art world anyway, in its kind of vernacular form, in its stylistic application, postmodernism tended to look like heterogeneous languages kind of rubbed against each other or put adjacent as a form of critique, but also as a way, as a sort of, in a way, it kind of, what am I saying? That stylistic application of postmodernism posited the artist as being above it all, as being smarter than all of these kind of languages which were variously complicit in odious ideologies, and that there was something a little like too cool about it for me. And I thought, well, there is no outside. What does this pretending you're outside do? Is it really critique, and is it really outside? No. So I thought I could do these. I could psychologize it and make paintings that were kind of pile-ups of heterogeneous source material that would kind of tell a story of awkward intimacy. So here we go. There'd be like pin-up calendar art meets physique people, and I put them all in these kind of Arcadian settings, and they're kind of joined in awkward ways that I don't know, tell a story about desire. But I realized later, I was the last to know that in fact I was telling a story about myself being kind of trapped in a marriage that I didn't want to be in, and I was allegorizing it. Oh well, that happens sometimes. Like here's a case. This guy was doing a push-up. I rotated him and found different partners for him, and the partners all came from kind of student figure paintings. Here they are. Here he is again. Ever striving. But then I kind of moved through that. I ended up in a new relationship, and so the kind of awkwardness of those becomes a little bit more playful and alive and peculiar. And the Arcadian settings start to become these kind of blurred, kind of soft Easter bunny hued landscapes. I went to Rome, and one of the things that kind of dazzled me there was seeing couples on scooters as they sort of like raced through the ancient city, and so it was like the most beautiful sort of like almost futurist kind of story about like the past, kind of framing these odd couplings of machine and bodies. So around that time, I was also making sculpture, and I would go to yard sales, and along the lines of the way I was talking about that painting of the woman, I would find these things that kind of struck me as like strange and a little bit nauseatingly cute, that must have been that were manufactured in order to be sold. And were sold and maybe cherished or given as a gift, and then finally finding their way into the yard sale. And so I would get them for like $3, but then I would join them with others to make these new hybrid objects that hopefully kind of retained something of those pasts to make these composites, assemblages. And this kind of kept going. I eventually started I was using paper pulp to kind of hold them together, and then, it would be a kind of form of editing and joining, and then it would make these new forms. And eventually I started to put plush into them, this kind of synthetic fur, because a lot of times the ceramic animals seem so odd and artificed, especially poodles. And so I made some larger ones with these oversized plushies, where I would get two of the same species. These are bunnies, kind of tie them up and start to cover them with the paper pulp until I arrived at what I thought was a kind of weird, dynamic, new form. This one I think I've finished many times. These are puppies. Here's another version of them. Eventually they even became something else altogether. I did a project for Saks Fifth Avenue, Palm Beach, doing their Christmas windows, and I thought of like making these kind of melted ice cream cone Christmas tree figures. It was kind of, I only have one image from the production of them. I don't have the whole thing, but it was kind of thinking about winter in a warm place. This is a poodle that I carved in stone. I went to Italy and spent a month at this workshop carving this marble. It was really a great labor of love, and I love thinking about poodle and fur and snow to make this new thing, which had a pillow on it. And I guess having been in Italy, I don't know if you guys know this term. I think it's archepoiesis. It means like an image that makes itself. Like the Shroud of Turin was one, but the original one within the Christian tradition is Veronica's veil, right? Jesus is like carrying the cross up to be crucified, and Veronica daubs his face with, sometimes it's called a napkin, or who knows what it is. Anyway, his face is miraculously rendered onto that cloth, which supposedly, and this is apocryphal, St. Luke, who is like the original icon painter, copied the likeness from Veronica's veil. So part of like the mystery of the icon, which is not like a representation, it actually embodies something of the true likeness. I guess Veronica, that's the word, Veronica. Makes it different from an observed representation. Anyway, so this is kind of magical too, but in this case, a clown. Oh, you can't see it, it's all burnt out. A clown cries into his pillow and leaves a magical trace. Yeah, there's something about the whites. All the whites are blazing. This is a sculpture I made of a wave crashing. And here are some sculptures I made of, this is an installation I did at a place called Triple Candy in Harlem, in which I used like 12-foot inflatable snowmen to make this great essay. So I tried to, the great thing about the snowman is it's a very simple kind of 3 spheres that is made into a figure, and somehow making a cloth air-filled snowman seemed already interesting and perverse. Tried to use all the parts. That's the air hole. And this is a massive thing. It's like 12 feet tall, but it's so I tried to desemiutize them, resemiutize them. They're all, and the thing you can't see here, which I wish it was a video, is that there's something about the fans that cause it to quiver. So the things had this kind of crazy life, and there were lights on the inside. So they had qualities of vitality, even though they're just chilly snowmen. So here's a group of sculptures I made one summer. That's the back, this is the front, which I thought of as just kind of rural vernacular sculpture, like just using a circular saw and a screw gun, more or less with the technology of like a roadside, vegetable stand. So these are deeply improvised. And sometimes like I've had shows in other countries where there's almost no budget, and so I figured out a way to, and it was kind of a game, and so this is another form of collaboration where you kind of set up a peculiar set of rules. And in this case, I would pick three paintings, three smaller paintings, and then try to paint on the wall to fill out a narrative that connects them. So you can sort of see there's a figure painting in which I painted a brick wall underneath it. There's an image in the center of a young veterinarian nurse, and then a landscape on the right. And then this is something I did 10 years ago in the basement of the Romanian Academy in Rome. And so there's only one small canvas, and it's the head of that predator. And this piece goes like for another 20 feet down that long hallway. This is just one little sample. Little brown dogs. Yeah, this Keith Talent Gallery started out like in the most derelict space in London Fields, but they were a very inspired, cool gallery, and I did a couple shows with them. They ended up going to jail. They committed some crime. I think they forged some documents, weirdly, for the sale of a Tom of Finland piece, and whatever. That's kind of an anecdote. I'm smearing their name, I'm dragging them through the mud, because my second show with them, I had like 6 or 7 large paintings, which they sold a couple of them, but the rest, I think, went into a dumpster. And it's just like really weird and painful. Anyway, so at a certain point in the early zeros, I decided to leave oil paint behind, goodbye to all that, and I started painting with acrylic. And partly to disorient my habits, but I was already moving in a kind of slightly pop vernacular way, and I thought like I was simplifying the forms. Anyway, here's a pair of kitties with peanut butter and bread. So kind of thinking about whiteness, I guess, and this kind of fecal nutrient that I don't think they're interested in having. More kitties. This is, like now I feel kind of slightly embarrassed, but I feel like I was an early adapter to kitties. I tend mostly to be a late adapter to things, technologies, but kitties, I was there before they became something that really no one should make another kitty painting for a long time. But I love there, and I was in a new relationship, and I liked the idea of the kind of like the fusion of the two, in a kind of wide-eyed attentiveness, maybe mixed with a little bit of obliviousness about possible threats or dangers. I mean, I guess that's kitties. Here they are distracted for a moment from their what should be their rightful instinct, which is to kill the bird. Puppies. Every time I go to the shore, as we call it here, I'm kind of astonished that almost every gift shop has towels and sculptural representations of porpoises leaping out of the waves like that, and it just seems kind of impossible. It seems like it wouldn't be good for them, and so I decided to weigh in on that image, that vernacular image. And I think coming to Vermont enough times and thinking about snow and the way snow kind of acts in relationship to landscape, the way it kind of covers things over and highlights the things that are not covered over, changed my work for a while. Thinking about paint, white paint, as being like snow on the canvas, this kind of chilly covering over. Snow couple. I'm going to start going more quickly because there's a lot more images. I think now we're somewhere in the late zeros. And I'm thinking about, I guess, I'm thinking about liquids again, like the snowman as a sort of a state of water. And so in this case, like the snowman in the warm place is on his way to becoming water again, like the blue on the lower left. He's kind of crying, he's melting. But I guess this idea of dissolution or the kind of the loss of boundaries, the blurring of boundaries, to me is an interesting subject because it represents it has an ecstatic potential where you get outside of yourself, you lose your boundaries. That happens in states of immersion, but it can happen in states of like dramatic performance. And in a way, I kind of thought, oh, this idea of the ecstatic performance could be rendered in the gesture. And I felt like all those years of working, I hadn't really embraced or thought about gesture as as an object. And so I started a group of paintings in which I really distinctly staged. I almost kind of painted them, or I began them in character, as though I was the kind of bold abstract expressionist. And this is acrylic paint, so I had to do it really quickly, and I might like execute these moves in under a minute, and then spend a month trying to kind of find a way to build it into a painting where there's the audience in the foreground, there's the microphone, the singer is no longer there, left with these traces. But it's very exciting to do a painting in which like the gesture is, you have to use a broom, or it's a giant brush and it's 6 feet, and then to try to then collaborate with that performance leftover. And also I wanted to kind of metaphorize it, like it wasn't just gesture, it wasn't just a gestural painting, it somehow has a resemblance to, let's say, a performance, like in this case, a drummer. And I think of her, this protagonist in a way, as being like the painter, the artist surrogate inside the picture, in which the business of striking or landing a blow is connected to drumming, the silent sound-making gesture, and the means of representation, the mark. So here's another wounded animal with a character in a state of immersion. And I thought of this one in a weird way as like he is taking care of the animal, but in some kind of way that animal is a split off part of himself, that it's a kind of weird self-care. Here's the young nurse veterinarian again. And in this case, she, like the bandage is on her own kind of bear paw. She's sort of fusing with the animal other. So I was thinking about pets. I was thinking about companion species. I don't know if you guys have read Donna Haraway. There's a really great and emerging literature on human relationship with animals, and pets being a kind of privileged version of that. But I guess I like thinking about animal-human relationships as somehow part of how we frame our understanding of what it is to be human, like with the kind of the machine on one side, the prosthetic object and the animal on the other. And so somehow, I guess the idea is that the boundaries are not very sharply defined, or rather they're constructed and they historically evolve, and that painting can somehow get in on that conversation. This is a massive painting. This is like 8 feet, where I really did get a broom and do this thing. And the black image, this will take too long, and it's a little bit kind of maybe irrelevant to the painting, but I just finished reading Proust, the Recovery of Lost Time, and just at the moment at which the Morgan Library was celebrating the centennial of his publication of Swann's Way, and there in the New York Times was a reproduction of one of the pages from his journals, and he had these goofy cartoons, like doodles. And so I've kind of projected them onto this great big gestural painting, and then I tried to kind of play with some of his themes of, I mean, he has a lot of interesting cross-gendered thematics in that book, which I'd love to talk to people about if people have read it. So here's some more animal paintings. When I was in Rome, I looked a lot at images of Hercules and the lion. One of his labors was to wrestle with the lion. And in many of them, like this embrace of the animal and human in combat constructs this kind of new hybrid organism that's like half lion, half human, in which, you know, their struggles, yes, they're trying to annihilate each other, but they also are mutually defining. And I thought that's a kind of a beautiful allegory, I guess. So here's a case where I just used the gesture to sort of scramble this kind of embrace. Thinking about gesture again in a different way, here's the figure inside the picture has kind of left a mark on the banister, which I hope kind of creates a sort of an idea of gesture, of mark making, that plays its way around the painting in unexpected ways. Here's where the scratch becomes a gesture, kind of causing the figure in the painting or the painting itself to bleed. Wow, this thing is so different from the screen image. I don't know, maybe someday it'd be worth calibrating, because there's a whole bunch of stuff in the upper left there. But I kind of like maybe the idea, and this has to do a little bit with Instagram, but I'm thinking about like this kind of peculiar character of the image. I mean, there's a painting, there's my photograph of it, there's the image on the screen, and then there's this screen. But that certain images maybe have the power to kind of sustain or have new vitalities, new life on the different platforms, in different iterations, in different states of degradation. And so, like, in fact, I like posting images on Instagram. I feel like if the image has a life, it might lose great quantities of the truth of it, but then there's something about the image that might be happy in the new context, the new distortion. I put this here because it's a painting of a air processing unit, and you can see there in the lower right, there's the up. You can make it warmer or colder in the space, but that I was thinking at the time about objects in the built environment that solicit a tactile relation, like doorknobs, buttons, dials. Like what are the things in our world that we make that ask us to touch them? Banisters. And I thought that, you know, that painting as a kind of a language of tactility, where touch, the act of touching, it gets scrambled with the act of seeing, that's an interesting set of relays and possible thematics. So this is a kind of a bad touch. This is a predatorial touch. Actually, a new one. I just made this like a year ago, but I'm retrojecting it. I'm inserting it back with earlier paintings. I mean, I like the idea that one can revisit themes, subjects, ways of working that have been abandoned. So this is kind of an interspecies coupling moment here with the birds, horses, one is kind of more, what do we call that? Tack. One is kind of bound and domesticated, or more so than the other one in this moment. This is a picture from my show a couple shows ago. So you can see like how blown out these crazy whites are. But I love having at least a sculpture or two in a show of paintings. I feel like it has a way of like bringing the paintings into kind of a more physical relationship to the room. There's ways of kind of drawing thematics out of the picture into the lived space. Here's another view of it. So then here are the paintings in the background. There's that one, which in a weird way I thought functioned. I mean, that's not me, but in the show, the way this character kind of slightly self-protected, sporty maybe, could function as a kind of like the author photograph at the back of a book. So here's a kind of a coupling. It's two horses, but two horses in different states of different modes of representation. And you can kind of almost see there's a little bit of a glowy warmth on the yellow that's caused by the red horse. And here's a very large horizontal variant on that. Here's that painting. I feel like this is kind of the artist at work, but the artist kind of overseeing the kind of lively paddock of animals in the ring there. But there's something like they're becoming glyphs of themselves. They're becoming kind of almost Paleolithic versions of their living self. And she's kind of distracted from that task, whatever it is. But I think like this subject of or making pictures about the act of looking, or in some ways folding the spectator into the picture interests me. And in this case, I feel like this spectator inside has a whole kind of neurological hair styling that kind of represents something of the relationship to what she's seeing, which are these ambiguous modern art figures. So this is kind of listening at the door, a different kind of spectatorial relation. I guess the idea of the closed door as a metaphor for the picture. It's the solid thing that you can't get past, but which there's something on the other side in the interior, the inaccessible interior. So in this case, and maybe I was even anticipating this painting with the way I described the neurological, cognitive, imaginative firing of what's going on in this. What is she doing? She's listening at the door. She's snooping. This is the anxious horse. So here comes a spectator. This is kind of the spaceman spectator observing this accident. But the accident, I feel like, is kind of generative of some kind of visionary psychedelic abstraction. I think painting has the capacity to think about, to wonder about other technologies, photography, the digital, not necessarily in a deep way, but maybe in an inadvertently deep way. And so I feel like I'm always kind of returning to ways of thinking about digital imagery, imaging, photomechanical, the reproduction, and the way it affects looking and seeing and understanding. So here's another spectator. Yeah, and in this case, these bird spectators have almost no understanding of what they're seeing. Yeah, there's a whole pink gestural weather up on top, which is gone. I'm going to start to, I'll supplement what you can't see. So I guess I like the idea, I mentioned this early on, like the idea of the sociability of artworks, that artworks, I feel like, seek out a relationship with spectators in a kind of casual way, like, hi, pleased to meet you, and then however it evolves from there. And so I want to kind of toy with that in this painting. Hey, take your coat off. Would you like a drink? Relax. So I have a bunch of paintings that I think have peculiar sociabilities. This one's like, hi, my name is Tara. This is the proud sculptor who's protected from something we don't know. Somehow, when the person in the picture turns their back to you, it becomes a new face. They face you with their ass, I guess. I'm getting a little self-conscious. It's 9:09. I think I've taken too long, and I want to get to the finish. So I'm going to start to race through images. So this is thinking about kind of oblivion and passivity as a sort of a visionary possibility. Like, here, this guy on the floor. Here's another one, recharging. I guess maybe oblivion and passivity as a form of resistance within our culture of, like, ever instrumentalized, monetized time. And so maybe, like, sleep is the last horizon of resistance. Okay, so these last ones, in the last couple of years, I've been sending some snapshots to, like, a vinyl printer, a sign printer, and they print them out on these big 7-foot vinyls, and then I kind of add things to them, paint on them, adjust them, and it is another kind of way of collaborating, and it's a way of, for me, of bringing the world into the paintings with a different sort of, like, edge, credibility. I can still vandalize them and inhabit them, but there's always this credible trace of things. And I love how truck tracks on the sidewalk are mud smears as a form of painting on sidewalks and streets. So these are almost all in the construction known as Long Island City, where I live. Okay, so then I'm trying to stretch up some of these vinyls, like that. There's that. I made that painting. Then I put a sculpture in front of that painting, took a photograph of it, and then I painted on it. And so these feedback loops start to kind of accumulate new sense in kind of a strange, kind of my own production from me, and then becomes somehow separate and other, with which I can then collaborate and build new logics. That's the sculpture that's in front of that painting. And here's a sculpture actually leaning into a paint. This is a vinyl printout of a drawing, which I painted on. It's a little confusing. There it is. But I thought of it as, like, the artist or spectator kind of reaching in, leaning into, modifying the image. This is just like a little drawing of muck smeared on a piece of paper, blown up to 7 feet, and then painted on top of. Okay, now these are all paintings from my last show, and I'm just going to dash through them. I'm starting to think about groups and how, like, how do groups constitute each other, and in this case, this is a super homosocial pile of cavorting dudes that I saw on a boat. And it was during the Kavanaugh hearings, and it was kind of having a very alienated feeling about our moment, of course. And thinking about Kavanaugh and his buddies, who probably had no idea of course, they didn't remember sexual abuse because they were doing it for each other. And that's what I thought I saw in these guys on the boat. So we're rushing to the finish, and I have I feel like that's the kind of freaked out poodle boy that would be me, maybe. Maybe that's kind of a good place to finish. I'm going to finish there, and I'm eager and happy to answer questions. I'm going to be around all week, so if you don't want to ask me now, that's fine, and I might be coming to some of your studios. Thank you.